Tēnā koutou katoa, ki tēnei tunga, hei whakanui I te kaha kitea me te ātete o a tātou taua mautohe. Ahakoa no he tātou, I ngā kōrero toko iho o ngā whenua katoa, o tātou tūpuna he takatāpui, he tangata uanuku, he tangata whakawhiti ira hoki. Kia ora, Leonie Pihama, korua ko Mani Bruce Mitchell. He ahinga a mātou, ki ta ahinga he ahinga mā tātou tēnei ki te whae whakaaro ki ngā wero o Inewa. Noku te onore ki te whakamohio atu ia kōrua ki tō tātou hunga mā takitaki. Ko Jack Byrne tōku ingoa, he tangata taritia hau, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome everyone to this session we have today, which is celebrating the activism and the visibility of people who have been doing this work for quite a long time, whatever their age are. Those of us who happen to be sitting here are all aged 62 or older, 61 or older. I know that because I'm 61 and I was born in 1962. My name's Jack Byrne. I'm an activist who was a dyke activist, and over time I've become a trans activist, and I've been doing that since I was 19. So that's since about 1982. We were to have a third person with us, Felicia Brown-Acton, who sends her almost greetings and her apologies because she can't be here because she ended up in A&E this morning because of some complications with some medication. But Mani and I talked with her this morning, earlier this week, and there'll be a few of the thoughts that she had that I'll put into the conversation as we go along, and I'll fill in a bit. But the other good thing about it is it gives us more time at the end for us to have a conversation amongst ourselves. I think I've only got one housekeeping thing to do at the beginning, which is for Rachel, the photographer, to wave her hand in the air, their hand in the air, and they are the person, if you don't want to have your photograph taken at any point, or you want to make sure you don't appear in any photos that are taken, just come and talk to Rachel about that at the end of the session. So the first question we have, rather than me introduce these wonderful people, I've asked each of Leonie, starting with Leonie and then Mani, to introduce themselves, and in that introduction include a little bit about their history of visibility around the issues we're talking about today, as takatāpui, intersex people, lesbian, whatever identities they have, and that doesn't have to be limited to the activism that happens in queer spaces, because we know queer spaces are not always the most inclusive of all of our communities. So if I pass over to Leonie.
Tēnā koutou. Tuatahi ake mihi tēnei ki a koe Jack, nau e whakatuwhera tō tātou hui e tēnei ahi, tēnā koe. Ko wai tēnei e noho ana I mui o koutou arawaro, ko taranaki, ko kari o I ngā maunga, ko Waikato, ko Tiatiawa, ko taranaki iwi ngā iwi, ko ngā te rāhere, ko ngā te mahanga, ko ngā mahanga taere ngā hapu, e moko puna tēnei o te maunga tītohia mihi ko atu ana, kia koutou katoa. He kui e tēnei, he māma tēnei, e moko puna hoki tēnei, He mihi hoki ki te hau kāinga o tēnei wāhi o Tāmaki Makaurau, a Ngāti Whātua, te iwi te mana whenua, tēnā koutou, me ngā iwi katoa, e hono nei no Waikato no Hauraki I roto I Tāmaki Makaurau. Greetings, my name's Leonie Pihama. I hail from Waikato and from Taranaki, and I just want to, first of all, I want to acknowledge Jack's opening of the session. I want to acknowledge this space and the land that we're on in terms of being Auckland Central and Ngāti Whātua land that was gifted by their tupuna when Auckland was designed to be the capital of this country. And so we're sitting on gifted land, which has then become commodified and stolen land. And so it's important to acknowledge that. And I want to acknowledge these tukutuku behind us that were gifted by the Māori community, and my understanding were brought in by Erewera and Amelia Sterling into this space. So it's the first thing we saw, Marjorie, my partner, and I, when we walked in, were these tukutuku, and they are stunning. And I want to acknowledge the signers who are doing the signing. I know how hard work it can be keeping up with people like us talking very quickly. So I'll try and slow it down. Yes, I don't know, you're welcome. I mean, as first and foremost, as a Māori woman, you know, we're born into activism. As tangata whenua, we're born into a struggle, whether we know it or not, whether we're aware of it or not. When you're a descendant of Waikato and you're a descendant of Taranaki, you're born into an activism that predates you know, the activism that we're now currently speaking to. And so, you know, being takatapui, and particularly having lived in Tāmaki from the age of 17 for like nearly 30 years, walked into, arrived in here I arrived in here when I was 22. I arrived in Tāmaki, I walked into a house, and there was Sharon Hawke. And so that was the beginning of the Hawke family relationship with Ngāti Whātua. And it was in a house, and the term takatapui wasn't being used in 1985 of Māori women lesbians, or a term that was used at the time for a group of Māori women and Pacifica Nations women was wahine mōna wahine o te moana nui a kiwa. So women that live with women of the Pacific, and Aotearoa is a Pacific nation. So that kind of immediately opened my eyes to a whole range of things. And we can talk a little bit more about that from that point on, but I moved to Tāmaki in 1985 because I knew that there was something about me that I wasn't fully conscious of. And it was when I arrived here and understood what it meant to have the kind of attractions to women that I had, which I didn't understand living in a small town like Waitara. It really did throw all of this together. So all of my activism is all combined. It's entirely intersectional. It's around tangata whenua, it's around takatapui, it's around classism, gender, it's all of those things.
Kia ora whānau. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Leonie. Mani Bruce Mitchell. But before I want to start, I just acknowledge the organisers and all the work that's gone on to getting us into this amazing space. So I grew up in the centre of the North Island, in remote rural New Zealand, so that's a huge part of who I am. But I was actually born here in Tāmaki, Mount Eden, 1953, so I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. We were talking about that before. Nuclear bombs, Holocaust were very much part of what I was aware of. And I guess the formative circumstance of my birth happened right when I was born. So I was identified by the young nurse who was with my mum that I was a hermaphrodite. That was the word that was used. So the medical picture at that point identified people who were hermaphrodites, intersex. It's interesting, the legal literature said that it was inappropriate to deny the rights and privileges of anyone who might be male privileges. So prior to the 50s, most intersex people were assigned male gender, which I was for the first year. And then, as you know, age 1 literally cut open, and then a decision was made, no, we'll switch to female, whatever that means. So that's the foundational stone of my life. And I now realise as an activist, it's formed out of that. Doing work many years later, working with my Australian psychotherapist, he looked at me once and said, "Shit makes good compost." My first journey, I guess, because growing up in rural New Zealand, you have no access to activism or any way of thinking outside of the conservative world that I was surrounded by, was going to Teachers College, and it was a protest against the arrest of the yacht Free, so around nuclear activism. That was the first thing I was involved in. So I came out as a queer person towards the end of my teenage years in Whanganui. And in that period of time, I was still identifying as female and came out as lesbian. And that's another story. And what do you do when the shirt you've put on doesn't fit? But you also know that you're not heterosexual. And I remember just feeling like I was hanging onto a cliff, as I felt if I fell off that space, there was nowhere to go. So that's enough from me for now.
Kia ora. And I'll just say a little bit because I'm sort of a fill-in for Felicia, and just so it's a bit of a conversation between the three of us. So yes, I'm from Mawhera on the west coast of the South Island, so kia ora to someone from the other west coast, and actually born the same year as Leonie. Huge debt in my life to being lucky that first generation got to go away to university and I went to Otautahi, and there it was Springbok tour my second year there, and then it was so lucky to have been around at the time that the Black Woman Speaking Tour started going around the campuses, and then a group of moved up here to Tamaki Makaurau, and a group of us joined Sharon and Betty Sewell and others on the Hikoi Tuaitangi in 1984. So huge debt to being, I'm sure we did things, I know we did things inappropriately. I remember walking on the Hikoi past Taupiri, and we started singing what was a lesbian song about mountain moving days are coming, and it was totally not appropriate to be singing that as we were walking along the road there. And feel very lucky also to have grown up in a working class family where people talked about struggle and unity and collectivism, and always about doing things with other people. There were lots of other shitty things that happened in my growing up, but that was a really positive thing about it. And then came out into the Dyke community when I was 19, lived in those communities for a long time, and then finally found out that trans men existed, knew I would lose my community, which I did at that time when I transitioned when I was 40, and had the lovely joy of finding other trans people, not many like me. There were very few of us at that time, but then we built a trans masculine community and have been part of trans activism and research, and when I get time, performance since that time. And so that's enough about me. And the next thing we really wanted to focus on, because the title of this session is We Have Always Been Here. And while it is true that queer, lesbian, gay, bi, transsexual, intersex, many other people, whatever words they used, have existed in all parts of the world forever, often without knowing others or without having terms, or maybe those weren't the most important terms for them, ways to see themselves. It is takatāpui who have always been here. So wanted to invite Leonie to talk about the amazing book and project, how it came about, why it came about, whatever you want to talk about. Kia ora, Leonie.
Kia ora. So the book Honouring Our Ancestors, so I want to talk about the cover first, because I realise that we don't have a description of the cover, but the cover was done by Kahutoi Te Kanawa, who's takatāpui, and from Waikato and from Waikato Maniapoto. And it reflects, of course, the rainbow colours and that relationship of, you know, the LGBTQI community utilising the rainbow colours. I mean, we need to remember the rainbow colours were not initially utilised first and foremost by the LGBTQI community. It became something, but was used for a lot of other equity struggles prior. And so it's a good fitting one. The top of the cover is actually Kahutoi's honouring of those who have passed, whether it be from HIV, young and old, whether it be from taking your own life, whether it be from having your life taken, as takatāpui. And then she has integrated brown for Papa Tuanuku and the black for Te Pō, for Ranginui. So has really taken the notion of the rainbow flag and added some distinctly Indigenous Aotearoa. And there are a number of other communities that have added other colours, as we know. So the book itself came out of a piece of work that we did, Alison Green and a whole team of us did, called Honour Project Aotearoa, and it initiated from an Indigenous Two-Spirit project that was done by Karina Walters and her team at the University of Washington at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. And some of you may have met Karina. She's Two-Spirit. She spent quite a bit of time here in Auckland talking about that project. And when she did, and that was like 2007 or 2008 at the University of Auckland. When she did, at that point I thought, oh, we need to do something. We need to do something around that. And it took a number of years, probably nearly about 12 years, before we could get some funding to do on a project piece of work, which included a survey of around 400 takatāpui and a whole range of interviews. And it was really driven by that kind of inspiration of hearing people's voices, particularly in the health sector and health access to health care and access to well-being for takatāpui, and also how that intersects in terms of our iwi experience, our Māori experience. And so yeah, we finally got to move on doing that work, and there's a lot. The book itself was really derived from the output of the project. There's a lot of, there's just so much stuff in it. It's very hard to speak to every one of them, the outputs of the project. But the survey came up with things that obviously we know, discrimination, but it kind of looked at where discrimination was being experienced. It looked at whether your GP knows, whether you're takatāpui, whether, you know, all those, what kind of access you have to healthcare. But it also asked about, you know, how do we identify ourselves? Do we utilise, what terms do we utilise in identifying ourselves? Things like, what are pronouns? What's the discussion around what pronouns you are? How does that relate to being Māori? And so there's a whole first couple of chapters around just thinking about the term takatāpui. There's about 3 chapters, I think, at the very beginning that looks just at that. So the term takatāpui, we know, was came from a story. It was, I think, kind of in academic terms documented by Ngā Huia, Te Awi Kōtuku in 1990 in her Mana Wahine work. But it pre-existed that, actually came out of her iwi in a discussion in a pūrākau, a traditional narrative around tūtānikai and tiki. So most people know the story of Tū Tānekai and Henemoa. Well, Tiki was Tū Tānekai's hoa takatāpui. And the term takatāpui in the dictionaries, Māori dictionaries, which is very old, refers to an intimate partner of this, an intimate relationship of the same sex. And so whether that means that Tū Tānekai and Tiki were in an intimate sexual relationship or not is almost irrelevant, because intimacy comes in many ways. And one of the things I think that we've really been clear about is, yes, we utilise the term takatāpui for Māori LGBTQI, but let's not reduce it to only that. That actually intimate relationships with people of the same sex can happen on a non-sexual relationship as well. So let's be all-encompassing. And so there are discussions in the book that were really important to us, I think, around the defining. And as I said, prior to that, Māori and Pacific women were using the term wahine mōna wahine o te moana nui a kiwa. That's how we referred to our relationships. And actually we had the first national hui for Māori and Pacific lesbian women up at Ngāti Whātua in 1990. So around the same time there was a lot of movement happening. And so we have a lot of, acknowledgement to those who, generations prior, that kua para te huarahi, that walk the pathway. All of us do. In fact, I was listening to the young panel prior, the Camp Rage panel, and I thought, it's really interesting what rage is to those young people now compared to what rage was for us in the 1990s or the 1980s. Not necessarily that the expression is different, although I think the words are different. I'm going, what do they mean by that one? But also, the languaging is different. But the other part that I thought was, are we actually passing down the history of our movements to the next generations? And actually, I don't think we are. And I'm thinking about iwi movements, Māori movements, radical movements. Are we passing down the learnings and the histories? And I think we have an obligation, and the age that I'm at now, and I have mokopuna now, so I have 6 children and 6 grandchildren. So I've always said to my own whānau, I have most of the kids in our whānau. I have the most children. That is takatāpui, I've done pretty well, given that they're all straight. I got the most mokopuna, so, but there's something about, and I think books like this and others, other really important books, including Huia's books on Manawahine and the books by, that Clive and Jessica have done around takatāpui are really important. I think we all need to somehow be telling our stories. So in many ways, this was telling our stories and inviting other Indigenous people in to tell some of their stories for themselves. And I reread it. I haven't read the whole thing pretty much since it went to the publisher, because, I'm looking at Anton and I'm thinking of all the books you've done. I do this one and I'm like, oh, I've done it now, and I put it on the shelf and I haven't read it again. So in the last week I reread it and I was reading it and I said to myself, hey, this is actually a pretty good book. I would buy this book. That's it's storytelling in a particular way. Yeah.
And it's kaupapa Māori research. How did that inform how you did it?
Well, everything I do is kaupapa Māori, pretty much everything Alison does. We are kaupapa Māori focused researchers, and so it was initiated, being kaupapa Māori, it's initiated by takatāpui, it's defined by takatāpui, it's undertaken pretty much by takatāpui. We had one heterosexual cisgender woman, that Māori woman, that worked on it, but pretty much we're all takatāpui in the team. And I'm using takatāpui in that umbrella term that we talk about, which is inclusive of LGBTQI+, in the Māori space. We had advisors who were takatāpui. So the whole thing was pretty much driven by our desire to know some things. Because, takatāpui, we think we know everything. but we don't. So, you know, and understand some of the other things that were happening and across the many communities. And I do want to acknowledge Manawaroa because, you know, she has passed since and before the final book came out, which was very sad for all of us. You know, she is someone, and she talks about in her article, she uses the term takatapui, transgender woman, and she was someone that really opened that pathway, particularly in terms of being in a small community. So she's from the same marae that I'm from Whatawhata, and opening that space in terms of moko kauai, in terms of karanga, in terms of acceptance within community, in terms of ensuring the well-being of young people that followed her, and so was a very good grounding person for the team. And so it means, and the kind of additional thing I think we did that was very specific is that we went around, we had 3 or 4 different hui before we started the project and talked to different takatapui organisations and groups around what they thought we should be doing. Now, reflectively, there are things that I don't, you know, that needed more work, for sure. I would like to see another national survey done where we could, because it was our first one, and really the only person who had done anything any close was Elizabeth Kirikiri with her smaller survey that she'd done. So groups like Te Whanawhana, you know, all of those organisations were behind the work and support the work.
Kia ora, Leonie. And Nani, in a bit of a similar sort of reflective way, the question I had for you next, and I will just prompt myself to make sure I stay on track, is trying to get a sense of what it is, what are the values that ground you in the work that you do, and maybe also if you wanted to mention, you know, some of the things that you feel really proud of, that, you know, because they speak to those values. Like when we talked the other day, you talked a little bit about, for you, the importance of communication, of importance of building, of creating conversation. So yes, so talking about the values behind what you do, what motivates you and keeps you going.
Kia ora, Jack. We've got a couple of hours, haven't we?
Yep, we do.
So as I look back on my life, like foundationally, I grew up in this very conservative but very loving household. Mum and Dad both had trauma experiences, and I don't have time for that, but you know, they came together and they loved each other and said about the task of having a family. But their conservatism and their trauma meant that it was very difficult working out what to do with a child who was what we would now call intersex or variations of sex characteristics. So it was managed in the era of the time by not talking about it. So I grew up with living in the farm, which was extraordinary and beautiful, with this family, and then there's the whole medical narrative. So I grew up very fragmented. And my dad would pass when I was in my early 20s, and Mum not long after it. So one of the things I'm very aware of is how do you make reality out of that fragmentation? And I realised that as a child and a person in my 20s, I was very good at presenting to the world in what I call paper mache. So it was generally a sunny, okay looking disposition, but behind it there was nothing. I didn't know who I was. I had this inkling of shame and terror, but it had no shape. So all these things had happened to me as a child, but I had no way of making sense of it. So I'm going to switch it around a bit and talk about the flag, because that's way of maybe talking about values. So and buried in my genetics is my dad. And I realise now he wasn't an activist in the true sense, but he survived the Second World War in a labour camp. So he knew about horrors that are going on in the world at the moment. So this flag, the yellow, comes out of a documentary, a historic documentary made over 20 years ago now by TV1, and it's called Yellow for Hermaphrodite. So you might know in the 50s, very binary, pink and blue, but I knew that women used to knit cardigans either pale green or yellow when the gender wasn't known. So I reclaimed it and went, well, not pale yellow, it's got to be bright yellow, so yellow for hermaphrodite. And then my friend Morgan Carpenter in Australia created the purple circle, and that's, we're born perfect, we don't need to be cut. So this flag has gone to be the symbol of intersex all around the world. So in terms of something that I'm very proud of, I think. And so with it, my dad was also, had a silly sense of humour, and that's part of me, and that's certainly helped with my survivability. So the thing I want to talk about today is sometimes what we're about is creating a whole new narrative, and maybe it's not creating, maybe it's reclaiming, because I think these narratives have existed in the past. And then things like colonisation, misogyny, roll over and deplete. So, I needed to create a reality out of a medical textbook. Because when I found out that I was an intersex person, that was my first access to information. Not a particularly healthy way of getting a sense of self, but within the 30 years that's gone on since then, the community has created its realities, and it's complex. So not all intersex people, in fact the majority of intersex people would identify as het and cis, which is interesting. I won't be around by the time we do research to work out whether that's a reaction of, being told that you're not okay, or that's how people are. So just know that the intersex community is very diverse and multifaceted. So yeah, I'm really proud of the flag representing Aotearoa and our kind of fuck you attitude to colonisation, but I'm also very clear that my ancestors' bones are in Aotearoa as well.
It's interesting because we think about, in parts of, honouring our ancestors, there's people, I think even like of Elizabeth's story about Te Whare Takatapui and talking about finding the carvings. And that when you live, I think for those of us who aren't Indigenous living here, and in the absence of rainbow spaces that continue to exist over time, that people go back to, where is the equivalent of our carvings, our flags, the photos of that auntie or that uncle, they're on the wall of a wharenui or the tukutuku panels, where are the things that someone doesn't need to already know who they are to actually sit among it and actually have a place that they can go back to, where they can know that they existed, they have always existed. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about any of that, Leonie, about how we create places that celebrate Takatapui?
There's a piece in the book by Kim McBreen, and Kim is actively questioning the term Takatapui, and she begins with a story around, saying, well, what would you call this person who has this kind of relationship? And the koia saying mokopuna. So which brings us back into, there's a bigger reclamation around whakapapa and around that we have always been here. And as we're trying to create, and that doesn't mean we don't create these spaces, because we have to create these safe spaces in this point and moment in time where there are unsafe spaces, which is pretty much out there, you know. But there is a bigger, longer-term vision. It's like the longer-term vision for tino rangatiratanga. Yes, we will fight this government over what they're doing. We will fight principles, we will fight, but the longer-term vision has never gone away. It's always been about tino rangatiratanga. And so I think there is a thing about a longer-term vision. And some of it, I agree with Manny, I think some of it is actually a reclamation and a returning. It's actually a returning, whatever that might look like, to an understanding that we have always been here. So the term takatapui being coined from that story and being utilised pretty much from the 90s. And so you do get, you know, we were really conscious about making sure we had a range of thinking in the opening of the book around how we language things. I mean, Carl Meekers is a deeply Māori philosophical approach, the worldliness and worlding ourselves, and questioning terms even like sex and gender. I mean, the English language is not from here. End of story. It's from somewhere else. It carries its colonial baggage with it. We can re-language that in different ways. We can reclaim definitions and shift definitions of it. The words themselves are not necessarily inherently oppressive. It's like Bell Hooks, she says what we do is not inherently, or theory that we do is not necessarily inherently liberatory. We have to make it be so. So the term takatapui is that because we make it be so. But we're also cognizant of actually it has been a more contemporary response to homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, heteropatriarchy, all of those things. It has been a contemporary way of speaking back to that. But it's not the end vision. The end vision is not having a whare. The end vision is having a world that is safe. Yeah.
And before we go to our last sort of main question, which is going to focus on the challenges the new challenges. Some of the challenges are the same old ones, but the particular challenges right here and now, what they are for you and the work that you do, and what your particular role, what role will you see for you perhaps as an elder. It's people's choice whether or not they take that word. But before I say that, I just wanted to mention one thing that Felicia shared this week, and she was happy for me to share with you when I asked her about her values. And the thing that she said is that she always grew up with the words of her grandmother, which was her advice was to always sit at the feet of your people. And she said, you know, that is a very Pacific way of service to your people, but people who from outside the Pacific communities might think that that's, you know, too self-effacing, but she says it's actually not about that. It's actually about being focused on those whose needs it's actually all about. And she gave the example that she does a lot of work at the UN and in UN spaces, but what motivates her the most is being back home and actually seeing through the work that she does through Whene Pasifika and other groups, is actually that it does make a difference to people's real lives for them and their whānau. So that's what she takes from always sit at the feet of your people. So now maybe I'll get you, Marnie.
Just before we move on, I'm remembering our conversation. The other thing that we shared is it's about love.
Yes.
Fundamentally. So on both sides from Felicia, you know, what drives us is love.
And you also both said that you were first generation rainbow warriors because there wasn't a rainbow person in either for Felicia as Nua and Whakawhawhine or for you as an intersex person. There wasn't someone else you could look to?
Not that I'm aware of. So on Dad's side, I whakapapa back to Scotland and Mum to Ireland. And no, there's no visible rainbow on my side either. But
that you also did get some of your activism from the values of your father.
Totally, yeah.
So now to the challenges now. Do you want to go first, Marnie? The challenges facing us now, and how you see your role with that and challenging them.
Yeah, so I started off saying I was born in the shadow of the Second World War, so I'm very aware of what had happened in Germany and the rise of fascism and, you know, my father's involvement in that. Mum involved in a different way, so was a young nurse here, and Tamaki was one of the, I don't know what they called it, where the soldiers came for respite and rest. So Mum was in a they literally used to get locked in. Anyway, they found out how to get out and come down, because it was much more exciting here, and Mum became pregnant. And so to an Air Forceman, and they were forced to get married, and he divorced her at the end of the war. So, you know, you have that narrative there. So coming back, I was hugely influenced as a young queer, in those days using the term lesbian, by those stories. And whenever we were involved in protests, because we're talking about the era prior to homosexual law reform, the men used to wear their pink triangles. So during the Holocaust, gay men were rounded up, and in the camps they had to wear their pink triangles. So funny story is that the socialists had to wear, I think it's funny, red triangles, but they would fade and they would end up with pink triangles and be very embarrassed and angry about that. Homophobia has been around a long time. So we saw, those of us who were here this morning, what happened, and I think we're in a very dynamic, potentially dangerous, but also shift change point on planet Earth. So we have this rise of extreme right, and it's all around the world, and it's connected. We have the template. The template is what happened in Germany, and those of us who are aware of it or have gone back and studied it, who did the Nazis, who were democratically elected? I think we've forgotten that. Who did they go after first? They went after trans women. That was the first group that was targeted and vilified by the Nazis. So I think we're at a time where we have to remember, but we don't have to repeat the past. But we're going to need to be creative, we're going to need to work together, and we're going to need to stand up to this violence and hatred and do it differently and be successful, unlike what happened. So I do see it as a dangerous time, but it's a time to stand on our toes and work together and work in awareness and make sure that this time round they are not successful.
Yeah, and it's clear that fascism in Aotearoa is really linked to white supremacy, and a huge proportion of the attacks are against Māori, both whether it's from fascist groups, from government, from the wider populace. There's such a wellspring of prejudice that can be tapped into so easily, and such an inspiration of resistance that has existed here for a long time. But I didn't get to go to Waitangi this year, but watched it on my phone, and I don't know. Yeah, so I guess I'm very aware of that's the context we're in right now too. So, what do you see as the challenges at the moment, Leonie, and what's your role or the role of people you love?
I mean, there's multiple challenges. The reality for us, I think, in Aotearoa, in particular in this national context, if this government is able to remove Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that is the beginning of the dismantling of every single set of rights in this country. So every person in the LGBTQI community should be fighting that. Because if our rights go, all rights will go. No matter what David Seymour likes to say, no matter how much he is performative around certain things. So I think that is a fundamental, that's always been the fundamental in this community. Once in all Indigenous communities, once Indigenous rights can be removed, dismantled, then everyone else will follow. And when Manny's talking about the whole, that post-war area, and what we saw in that context was that whole thing of coming for one community, then coming for the next community, then coming for the next community. That's what they do. They don't stop at the one community in terms of oppression. They move to the next. Once you undermine a foundation, you can continue to move relatively straightforwardly into the next community and the next community. And that's what we see. So we have this national level fight
against each other.
that we actually need to ensure that people are coming in behind those who are leading these fights and supporting it in whatever way works for you. So one of the young women on the panel this morning said, when are we going to start doing illegal things in terms of the protests for Palestine? Well, we did many illegal things many times. So maybe it is the next generation's time to be in the rest line. There's nothing wrong with civil disobedience. We have civil disobedience in Taranaki that dates back to the 1880s in Pihama. Civil disobedience against an oppressive regime is what we should all be thinking about. It is how we do it, and the process by which we choose to do that, whether it be in a peaceful way of doing it, whatever. But we need other groups to be actually standing up and doing that and challenging that. So, we have that here. We have what's happening in Gaza, which is horrific. And the three white boys had to get together, the colonising governments had to get together the other day before yesterday, to finally say they might do something. Well, it's too fucking late. You don't get to call out for a ceasefire 2 days ago when genocide's been happening for, 7 or 8 months, just in this period of war, not counting since the 40s coming through. So there is a huge battle on our hands, I think, at the moment. There is a enabling of white supremacy happening worldwide, and it will take all of us to come together and to challenge that. And I do think that thing, when I was saying about, are we sharing the stories with the next generation? They don't have to be our birth children. They don't have to be our children. They can be nieces and nephews and cousins' children, anyone's children. We should be sharing the history of the homosexual law reform, of how many people were protesting in that, how many people were arrested in that, how many people's lives were changed by putting their name to a newspaper ad, which I saw many of around homosexual law reform. How many long-term collaborators and collaborations were broken when certain people refused to vote for homosexual law reform, for civil union bills, those kinds of things, for the way that certain individuals in this country have carried this stuff on behalf of the collective. So we have a saying, he waka eke noa. It's a saying that's often used, and it's about a canoe moving forward. A lot of people utilise that saying, but inside that saying, that whakatauki, is the notion of collective movement. A waka cannot move forward freely and without constraint unless everyone on that waka is doing their role, is doing the task of moving it. So I think I think our challenge first and foremost is kotahitanga. For Māori, that has been a challenge that our people are rising to, and I think the rest of the country needs to rise with it and rise to it. And that's not easy, because I know, and many of us in this room will know, particularly through the 80s, the difficulties, I'll say in the lesbian community, when many Māori women takatapu were saying, "This is not my community," because of the racism that was embedded. And we did a lot of work in the 80s, and I feel like we've had a kind of 20-year cruisy stint. Well, the cruise is over. It's actually time to get back into the work and do it in whatever way we can contribute to. I mean, that's a long reply, but it's actually short for me.
And Jack, I'm remembering that Felicia wanted us to talk about the COVID and then linking it with the AIDS crisis. What happened in this country, and that the AIDS Foundation is one of our longest enduring organisations, and how what happened here led the world in terms of the response to the AIDS crisis, around things like needle exchange, making free condoms. So I just want to acknowledge that Felicia had wanted to talk about that.
That came out of a discussion about for how many of us, whether any of the rainbow groups that we'd been involved in still existed. And for many of us, the actual organisations didn't exist. The relationships existed, but relationships, we all know of people from the time that we worked with that have passed away. So how do we embed it when we don't have an organisational history? We don't need organisations, but we need the history of it. And Felicia said actually for her, the first organisation she was involved in was the AIDS Foundation. Photo shoots, that she was involved in. And
the work that she did, bridging that space with conservative religious aspects of her culture.
And how she was able to do that.
Both Felicia and Betty Seal have done a lot of work in that space with the various church groups in the Pacific communities. And there are numerous people, I think, that have put, there's a piece in here by Clive, from Clive Aspin, around the work that he has done around HIV/AIDS. And there is, I think, there is something around the COVID stuff that needs a lot more engagement around the impact on particular communities and the way in which that played out. And I know that Clive says very clearly in here, there's still a huge amount of work to be done in terms of knowing what has been happening in the HIV/AIDS community, this area. And that still really hasn't been done in a major way. I think there's a lot of work that hasn't been done in the Takatapui and the LGBTQI plus community, a lot. And I think Alison might have talked to you, Manny, around the survey. We got very few people who responded and named themselves as intersex. And so, that's a whole community of Māori whānau that is still, because of the way in which that is seen and the discourses around being intersex, are still not able to speak freely. And we know that. We know that as Takatapui. So in terms of the transgender community, Takatapui transgender community, and as I said, when we were going around with the community hui, nearly everyone said, it's Takatapui. Don't say Takatapui wahine, Takatapui tāne, Takatapui trans. Don't say that, because it's a collective term. And so we haven't. And the chapter by Manuaroa and Alison speaks around that as well. But there is a lot more work to be done, to be visible. Actually, one of the things that came up in the qualitative work, a whole lot of things came up, was this visibility, this notion of visibility, of knowing someone. And I would have said, I didn't know anyone who was Takatapui when I was growing up, or LGBTQ at all. I could have said that. And then I remember my mother saying there are about two wahine, two older women in Waitara who were like that. And the fact she could even say that was really interesting to me, because I thought, there was someone there that I knew. I just didn't know I knew. Yeah. Because at that point, I knew from about 12 that I was attracted to a woman. So I didn't know what that was called. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't fit, all those things that you have. But visibility, knowing that there's someone to go to. And I think the other biggest thing, apart from all the stats and all that, which we know, but in terms of well-being, what was really clear is that people said, if there was someone in my whānau that accepted me, That was what was important. I can deal with homophobia in my community, I can deal with transphobia, I can deal with all that stuff as long as there is someone in my whānau that is there for me. And when we speak to whole Māori communities, that's a big deal. Because when we talk about the Honour Project and we give some of the detail of what's happening, you know, we can read the room. I can tell the Māori woman in the corner who's squirming in her seat. I mean, you know, who have difficulty with that. But when we come to the end and we say, the key well-being factor for Takatapui in terms of being well, in terms of not self-harming, in terms of not running away to Australia, is someone in their whānau was there for them, was their person. You know? And for some, that ended up being a kaupapa whānau, so someone in your kura or someone in your kohanga, but that is key. So visibility and having someone there that looks like you, that feels like you, that is like you, that can relate, you can relate to, and they can relate. But also having just someone there who says, you are mine, you are ours, and that's what counts. Mm. So that's very powerful, and it's very powerful for a Māori audience to know.
Mm. Especially because whānau is so big, you know, if you
So
said that
big.
to a Pākehā family, it might be, you know, between the three of us, which one of us is going to be there for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe if you're an Irish Catholic family like mine, it would be a bit bigger. And I know there's other people here who are linked to other research like Identify, and I'm involved in Counting Ourselves, and all of that research finds the same response. If there are people there who care for you, that makes a huge difference. We've got just a couple of minutes.
Just before we go, it seems appropriate to acknowledge Georgina because of her extraordinary visibility, not only in Aotearoa but around the world. Yeah. And she would have loved to have been here today, I'm sure. I miss that laugh so much. We did work together over the years, and there's just a hole where she used to be.
And that work that she was doing about the Waitangi Tribunal claim has been picked up by Kevin Haunui and Te Whanewhana. So that work goes on. Would the work that any of us do go on with, if, you know, tauiwi within our communities? Do we have the same intergenerational ways of maintaining the work, sharing it and maintaining it so it doesn't get lost? It's probably just a couple of minutes now. If there was anyone, because many of you there are activists, you have been involved in our communities for a long time. Was anyone who wanted to ask a question or make a contribution? Luca. There is a mic there. I think it gets picked up better on the recording if you speak into it. I think it's about the recording that it makes it better if you speak into it. Yeah. Yes.
I think of myself, my activism beginning a couple of months before my 15th birthday, when I went to Ohakea and protested about the Vietnam War. But actually, I was born in 1951. So here in Tamaki, the elders were being burnt on Okahu Bay. And at the same time, coming from a working class family, the
waterfront.
1951 waterfront. So they were actually my contributing factors. I came out in 1978 as lesbian, and returned to New Zealand to Aotearoa the year before, and was on Bastion Point, and have been involved in all the movements, the change, the activism since. I just wanted to address your point about rangatahi, Leonie. I know some of our children are the same age, and I have two mokopuna, who are both gender diverse, and I say I was the first person to misname them and misgender them because I was am a midwife, and they are such a hope for the future. They're about to be 10 and about to be 16, and they're fucking magnificent. They are interested in our stories, and I do share them, and that's what I have to say.
Oh, kia ora. Oh, look, it's right on time. So now I just have to read the thank yous. First and foremost to all of you for coming along and participating, listening. Some of us may be around a little bit afterwards if you want to chat. My next thank yous are to the funders, and there's meant to be signs around everywhere that say who they are, so pointing to them. The women's bookshop stall down there, I know they've got copies of Leonie's book and of the other people who are presenting. Obviously, we didn't have time to talk about all the examples of the important intersectional work that needs to be happening. I work with Rainbow Path around the issues for rainbow refugees and asylum seekers. I know that there's some staunch disability activists here, and I hope, this is getting to the next bit, that you go and see the next events that are on today, including Etta Bollinger's doing the Peter Wells lecture on queer resilience. That one's at 5:15, and before that there's an editors panel. So they're all happening here. And then at 7 p.m. there's the reading of Robert Lord's diaries. And 7 p.m. tomorrow night there's another book launch at Time Out. And then that bit that feels really boring to do, to fill out the evaluation form, but it's really helpful for them to be able to get funding. And also if you fill it out while you're here, you get a free Camp Rage magnet. So fill it out here to get your magnet, or otherwise do it online afterwards. There's also, for those people who want some free name and pronoun stickers, there's some of them on the merchandise stall over there. And now I apologise again for speaking so quickly. For the sign language interpreters, and I will very slowly close this session. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It was a privilege to be on this session. Thank you.